was privileged to get to share the word as well. Why don't we just start off? I'm going to be sharing from Psalm 46. So why don't we just start off by reading that all together? Oh, it's even here on the screen. How good is that? So if you have it in your Bible, yeah, go ahead and turn there. It's Psalm 46. And I'll read it from the ESV, is the translation I have. God is our refuge and strength, a very present help in trouble. Therefore we will not fear. Though the earth gives way, though the mountains be moved into the heart of the sea, though its waters roar and foam, though the mountains tremble at its swelling. There is a river whose streams make glad the city of God, the holy habitation of the Most High. God is in the midst of her. She shall not be moved. God will help her when morning dawns. The nations rage, the kingdoms totter. He utters his voice, the earth melts. The Lord of hosts is with us. The God of Jacob is our fortress. Come, behold the works of the Lord, how he has brought desolations on the earth. He makes wars cease to the end of the earth. He breaks the bow and shatters the spear. He burns the chariots with fire. Be still and know that I am God. I will be exalted among the nations. I will be exalted in the earth. The Lord of hosts is with us. The God of Jacob is our fortress. This is the word of the Lord. So, I don't know about you about this psalm, but when I read this psalm, it's a very psalmy kind of sounding psalm, isn't it? It's got all the nice bits that you'd hope to hear in a psalm about God being our refuge and our strength. Just the perfect length of a psalm, not too long, not too short. Feels very nice. Just feels comforting to read the psalms like this, I think. But I think there's another side to this psalm as well that we see that is not just nice and sweet and comforting and all, butterflies and roses. But there's some crazy things going on in whatever the guy who wrote the psalm is going through. There is some crazy things going on. We see feels like the earth gives away in verse 2, the mountains being moved into the sea, and the waters roaring and foaming, and mountains trembling. We see later on there's wars around the world in verse 9, bows breaking and spears shattering. So it's not all just nice, fun, great times, but there's a little bit of chaos going on, I think, in the world of this psalmist. And I think that's something that really none of us need a big introduction into, is it? To chaos. Our year, this past year, as we've kind of been updated, did not go according to plan. Times it felt very, very chaotic. Like just everything from all sides was coming at us. And I'm sure it's not hard to look around today and feel that same way. Maybe on a personal level, whatever's going on in your life, in your family, feels like chaos and out of control. We can look on a global level and we can see there's a lot going on outside of us as well that feels a bit chaotic and out of control. Wars in different parts of the world, chaos. So what do we do? What do we do in the midst of the chaos? I think it's an important thing. Before we get really, really into it, I want to read one other just little story from the Gospels, because I think it goes along. It's a perfect little accompany to this psalm, where Jesus calms the storm in Mark chapter 4. So I'm just going to read this real quick for us, starting from verse 37. Well, so Jesus in this story, he's just finished a whole day of preaching and teaching. He gets into a boat with his disciples, and they're going to go to the other side of the sea. And he falls asleep. And then this is what we see, starting at verse 37. We see a great windstorm arose, and the waves were breaking into the boat, so that the boat was already filling. But he, Jesus, was in the stern, asleep on the cushion. And they woke him, and they said to him, "Teacher, do you not care that we are perishing?" And he awoke, and he rebuked the wind, and he said to the sea, "Peace, be still." And the wind ceased, and there was a great calm. And he said to them, "Why are you so afraid? Have you still no faith?" And they were filled with great fear and said to one another, "Who then is this, that even the wind and the sea obey him?" So we see at the start, the disciples are stuck in the boat and the storm comes out of nowhere. Don't you love their honesty? When they wake up Jesus, they said, "Don't you even care? Don't you care that we're perishing? Do you see what's going on here, Jesus? Do you see the waves? Do you see the winds? Do you feel the rain smashing on us? Do you see that the boat is filling up already? We're about to go over. Don't you care?" Don't we feel like that sometimes? Have you ever prayed a desperate prayer like that? When it feels like the whole world's caving in on itself and you say, "God, do you even care? Do you see what's going on? Do you see what's happening in my life? Are you going to do something about it?" I think that's a very real prayer. But what happens? We see Jesus wakes up. And the first thing he does is he rebukes the wind and the waves with just his voice. He says, "Peace," and there was peace. He just says, "Be still," and it was all still. And now all of a sudden, the disciples, I think this is interesting, who were afraid of the storm, they'd seen the waves and the water, that was scary. But now all of a sudden they look at Jesus who's just spoken and all of this stops and they're even more afraid. Isn't that an interesting response? I think they thought this was big and scary and powerful, but all of a sudden they realize, they look at Jesus and they're like, "Whoa, this here is where there's real, true power and authority," and it scares them. And the question that they have at the end, I think this is a great question for us to ask in the midst of this chaos. The story closes with them saying, "Who then is this?" So who then is this Jesus? I think that's the key. When we're in the middle of that storm, when the waves are beating us down and the boat feels like it's about to flip over, we have to ask ourselves, who then is this Jesus? And that's the question we're going to ask as we go through this psalm today, Psalm 46. And so, to get a great understanding of this psalm, it's helpful to look at how this whole psalm is structured. In English, we have different ways of writing and different ways of speaking. If we want to emphasize a point, we can use things such as repetition or alliteration. And these are literary techniques, I guess, that we use to draw attention to certain things and help people understand what we're saying. Well, in Hebrew, one of the ways that they helped us understand what they wanted to say was through the order that they structured their writing. And so this psalm is a perfect example for us. Many psalms are of a structure that's called a chiastic structure, a chiasm. So to help us understand really quickly, we're just going to walk through this structure, and it'll be up here on the screen. So basically how it works is the very first point and the very last point parallel each other. And slowly we move in. The second point and the second last point are parallel points. Third point, third last point, all the way in with these steps until you get to the central point. And then that central point is what the author is really specifically trying to get at as the main point. And then we work out. So we can see, first of all, in verses 1, verses 11, we see that God is a refuge. It says that in verse 1, God is our refuge. It says in verse 11, it closes with God is our fortress. Then if we go the next step down, verse 2 and verse 10, we see in verse 2, we do not fear, paralleled with what's in verse 10, which says, "Be still." The next point in, verses 3 and 4, and then 8 and 9, show us that God rules first over natural calamities, in verses 3 and 4 with the waters and the mountains and all of this. Verses 8 and 9, we see God ruling over political calamities. We see him over the wars, over the nations. We take another step in, verses 5 and 7 then show us this, that God is present. Verse 5 says, God's in the midst of her. Verse 7 says, the Lord of hosts is with us. And then finally, that brings us to our center point then in verse 6, where God is contrasted to the nations. So we see the first line of verse 6, the nations rage, the kingdoms totter, and then that's contrasted with God speaking and the earth melting. And this is interesting. I think we're seeing the exact same thing that we saw in the story of Jesus calming the storm, where start of verse 6, the nations rage, kingdoms totter. That's scary. That's like the storm, where that's big. Nations rising and falling and raging. That feels scary and out of control. But then it's contrasted with how does God respond? The second part of verse 6. The ESV says, God utters his voice, so God speaks. He doesn't have to rage. Just with God speaking, what happens? The ESV says the earth melts. Isn't that crazy? Just like with the disciples, they thought the storm was crazy and out of control. And then they saw, whoa, Jesus here is the one who would just through speaking, calm the winds and the waves. Here in this psalm we see the nations raging and the kingdoms falling. But when God speaks, the earth itself melts away. So that brings us to our first big point here up on the screen in verse 6, that God speaks into the chaos. And don't we see this all throughout the Bible? It's not a thing we see just here in the psalm. It's not just in Jesus speaking and calming the storm. The Bible starts off with this very idea that God speaks in a powerful way. That's what the whole creation account in Genesis 1 is. There's even this underlying sort of connotation of what the void and the darkness before the world. There's this underlying idea of confusion or chaos. And what happens? God speaks. Isn't that crazy? We all just take a minute to pause and think about God speaking and creating the world. Have you ever tried that? I tried this, and it didn't go very well. I just tried, because I was thinking about it, I have to be able to say, I've actually tried this, because who knows, maybe I can speak something into existence. So the other day I was like, all right, I'm just going to go out, I'm going to say, let there be a dog. And you can probably guess how it went. No dog came into existence in front of me. But God, in the creation account, there was literally nothing, and God just said, let there be light, and there was light. Let there be stars and a moon, and they came forth and existed. Let there be an earth and waters and seas and animals and plants. And just through speaking, God has the power and the authority to just create, just to bring things into existence that didn't exist. And that's how the whole Bible starts. It's just God speaking everything that we see into existence. And that's how it all began. So if that doesn't give you a sense of, oh, this is the guy who's in control of things. This is the guy who's got authority over things. I think it's great, isn't it? When we're in the middle of the chaos. When it feels like the wind and the waves and the rain is crashing down on you. We can be reminded that God's the one who created the wind with just his voice. He created the waves and the rain. And it all follows still. And it is under his authority. And when God speaks into the chaos, there is nothing that's impossible. Jesus calming the storm is a great example of this point. With just speaking, the winds and the waves obeyed him. And isn't Jesus just himself the ultimate fulfillment of this point? God speaking into the chaos. You know, the incarnation, Jesus becoming a human, says to us in John 1, the Word became flesh and dwelt among us. God was, in the beginning there was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. So God is, in the ultimate sense, the Word speaking. And Jesus then, in that sense, is God speaking in just a practical, tangible way into the world. God has inserted himself through speaking, through the word into the world. And so God speaks into the chaos is what we hear what we see right at the center of this psalm. If we take our step back then, that brings us to our next point, verses 5 and 7. God is with us in the chaos as well. What does verse 5 say in this psalm? God is in the midst of her. She shall not be moved. God's in the midst of his people. And God will help her when morning dawns. How about verse 7? The Lord of hosts is with us. The God of Jacob is our fortress. I think this is a fascinating thing. Again, we see all throughout Scripture that God is with his people. I did a quick look because I was curious about this. I don't know if you guys I find so fascinating the way that God calls people throughout the Bible, the way that they respond. So I found quickly 6 examples, I'm not going to go through them all, of God calling people in the Bible to do something. So Jacob, Moses, Joshua, Gideon, Jeremiah, and the disciples. There's 6 examples where God calls someone specifically to do something. And in each of these cases, the response is pretty much, no, I don't want to do that. That seems too hard. That seems like too much. I'm too scared. Whatever they say. But in each one of these examples, God's response is the same. He says, I will be with you. I think that's interesting, isn't it? God doesn't call them, and when they object, he doesn't give them some sort of a nice pep talk saying, no, you can do it. I believe in you. You're awesome. I know you can do it. Go Moses, He doesn't just try to psych them up to go and do this thing. He doesn't just encourage them, but he says, I will be with you. And so what does that imply for us? It implies, I'm going to be the one to take care of it. It doesn't depend on you. I'm the one with the power. I'm the one with the authority. And I'm not going to leave you, but I'm going to make sure that this plan goes according to plan. And again, I think Jesus is the ultimate example and fulfillment of this idea, that God is with us. We've just come out of, a little while ago, a few weeks now, but come out of the Christmas season. Don't we say that all the time? Emmanuel, God is with us. Jesus is the ultimate way of God being with us. And I was thinking about this Christmas season, before I was even thinking about this sermon. Isn't it interesting how God chose to come into the world? Jackie and Teo have a pretty crazy birth story that did not go according to the birth plan. I think Mary has a pretty crazy birth story that didn't go according to her birth plan. I can't imagine that she drew up her first child being born when she wasn't married. She was in a foreign place. She is ending up in a stable. She's probably not surrounded by doctors and the finest medical equipment in the land. She's probably quite alone and scared and probably cold if it's winter. I imagine that was a chaotic room when all of a sudden they're like, the baby's just coming and we're going to go back behind into the stable and this is where it's going to happen. That was probably a chaotic situation. But that is really how God chose to enter into the world. If he is the one with all power and all authority and in control of all things, he could have chose any way he wanted to come into the world. He could have come in the nice, cushy, 5-star, rich family with all the cushions and all of the food and all the heating and all of this. But he chose to come literally in quite a chaotic situation and to be with us. That's the way he wanted to come. His birth shows us that God is not afraid of the chaos. He's not far away in the chaos. He doesn't wait for us to pull ourselves together and get out of this messy situation. But it shows us he is right there with us. He is not afraid to get his hands dirty. He will not leave us, but he will come to us and be with us in the midst of the chaos. What a comfort I think that is. Then if we take another step back, This will take us to our third point. Remember, we always have this question: who then is this Jesus? In the midst of the chaos, who is this Jesus who's with us? Well, verses 3 and 4 and 8 and 9 show us that God rules over the chaos. We see in verses 3 and 4 with the earth giving way and the mountains moving into the sea and the waters roaring and foaming. There's all this natural calamity going on. God is the one who rules over that. In verses 8 and 9, we see there's this wartime kind of language but God, what do we see in verse 9? It says he makes the wars cease. He breaks the bow and shatters the spear. He burns the chariots with fire. So God is the one who's ruling over these political situations, which nations rise, which nations fall. Does not feel relevant today. There's a lot of political craziness going on, but actually God is the one who rules over that still. It's not out of his control, as much as it may feel out of control. And so whatever situation you find yourself in, whether it's something personal, whether it's something in your family, it is not bigger than God. God is the one who rules over it. And I love verse 8, how it invites us in. It says, "Come behold the works of the Lord." In other words, see what the Lord has done. You know, with all this kind of wartime language, I think a great way to put it would be, remember the victories that God has won. And if you're a follower of Jesus, you have at least one victory that you can remember, that you need to remember. You know, even if you look around at your life and it feels like everything else has fallen apart, none of it's gone according to plan, you think to yourself, how did I get into this situation? This is not how I thought it would go. Well, Jesus, through his death and his resurrection, he's brought you from death to life. He's done a miracle in you. Though you were once far away, he's brought you near. He's adopted you. He calls you a son or a daughter of God. Jesus has literally defeated death. And we can look forward to a time when every wrong is made right, where every tear is wiped away, and we're going to enjoy eternity with Jesus in a new heaven and new earth. And there's nothing that can take that away from you. This is where the gospel gets practical in our lives, isn't it? You know, we talk in Sicily about how there's this outward appearance of being religious, but it doesn't impact your life. This is how the gospel gets practical. This is the victory that has been won for us, that in the chaos, no matter what situation you find ourselves in, we can hold on to this. If you feel stuck in the guilt of the failures of your past, Jesus gives you his righteousness. If you feel trapped or stuck in your sin, in something that you can't break out of, Jesus is the one who gives freedom. If you feel alone and cut off, like no one understands you, God brings you into his family. He calls you a son or a daughter. If you feel stuck in shame for things that you've done or things that have been done to you, like you're too dirty or broken for anyone to ever love you, Jesus steps down and picks you up and he brings you in. You're never too dirty or broken for God. So this is when we ask ourselves again, who then is this God? Well, I think when we see him for who he is, we've seen three reasons here that he speaks in the chaos, that he's with us in the chaos, and that he rules over the chaos. Well, when we see him for who he is, then that's when we get to this point. If you take the next step out, verse 2 and verse 10, where we will not fear. This is what that does in our lives. You know, doesn't it sound easy? You reread this, oh, we will not fear. I know for me, sometimes I'm like, man, I wish I could just stop fearing then. Wouldn't that be nice? Sounds so simple. And it really is. I mean, it is simple, I guess, but it doesn't mean it's easy. It doesn't mean it's easy. But verse 10, I think, gives us a cool, almost practical way of how can we stop fearing. Well, verse 2 has said, we will not fear. Verse 10 says, be still and know that I am God. This be still is important. It's kind of language like was used for resting, for Sabbath in the Bible. It literally just means stop. Just stop. Or I think you could say, stop striving is what it means to be still. When we fear, when everything around us feels like it's falling apart and out of control, isn't that our natural reaction? Is to just grab hold of whatever we can, to try harder, to do more, to be better. Isn't that the natural response? We just strive for whatever reason. Well, I think then this be still, this stop, is a great way of actually proving that we can, in fact, not fear, and that we do, in fact, trust God. Why? Because when we stop doing, when we stop this striving, it kind of just forces us to acknowledge, actually, yeah, I'm not the one who's in control. I'm not actually the one who can hold it all together, but I'm just going to let God be the one to do that. And so if not fearing is what we're striving for, this is the goal. I think being still is the action step, or the way that we can actually train ourselves, the discipline to get ourselves to this not fearing. But we can't forget the other half of that verse as well. It says, be still, what? And know that I am God. So we need to remember, we need to recognize who God is in the stopping. And it's a practical way we can, I literally think, train our bodies just to stop, to rest, to trust, to not fear. And we can have full confidence when we do that God's plans, they're the ones that are going to come to pass. That's how verse 10 ends. It says, God is proclaiming, I will be exalted among the nations. I will be exalted in the earth. It's not a question. It's not a hopefully, if it all goes well. It's just a statement. God says, I will do this. My plans are going to happen. And we can be confident in that. And so for all of these reasons then, as we take our last step out, that is how God is our refuge, our help, and our fortress, as we see in verse 1 and verse 11. The Psalms, I think, broadly, they teach us two big things about God. Firstly, that he's good, and secondly, that he's great. And you can't have one of these without the other. You can't have a good God who's loving and kind and gentle, but not great, because what good is a nice person if they can't do anything to help you? If they have no authority, if they have no ability to affect your situation. You can be as good and as kind and as nice as he wants, but he's not very helpful. A God would not be worthy of being worshipped if they had no power. But on the other side, a God could be mighty and strong and powerful and have all the authority, but if he's not good, that's just scary. That's terrifying. But the psalm teaches us both of these things, that God is both great and he's good. And I think this psalm shows us that as well. We see that God is the one who speaks with all authority into the chaos. We see that he's the one ruling over all of the chaos. That's greatness. But we also see that he is with us. He is our help. He is our fortress and our shield. He's close. That's his goodness to us. We see both his greatness and his goodness. And so because God speaks into the chaos, because he's present with us in the chaos, because he rules over all things, when we see him for who he is, this is how we will not fear. And this is when he truly becomes our refuge, our help, and our fortress. And so I hope that this can be an encouragement to you this morning. Well, maybe you feel a little bit like this sermon is for you. If you'd feel that way, you're actually mistaken. This sermon is for me, just so you know. This sermon is very practical in my life. We feel all the time like we are in that boat with the waves and the wind and the water rising. And we're crying out, being like, God, do you care? Do you see what's going on? So fortunately for me, I get to just preach this sermon a couple times here and hopefully just let it speak into my heart. And this is our hope going back into Sicily, and this is why we're trusting God's plans going into Sicily as well. But I hope that wherever you find yourself, maybe this new year started off great. Maybe it started off already you feel like, how have I gotten here? How have we just tanked so hard at the start of this year? Cling to these truths, that God speaks into the chaos. That God is with you in the chaos, and he rules over all the chaos. And let him be your fortress. Let him be your refuge, and let him be your help. Amen. I'm just going to pray as I finish. God, we thank you for this time together. We thank you that we can gather just as your body, as brothers and sisters. God, we come from all different places, all different backgrounds, different experiences, different views of the world. So many things that could easily divide us. But God, we have unity in you. We share something in common so deep that the world could never understand. That all these things, though they could threaten to divide us, yeah, we have perfect peace with one another and unity in you, God. And I just pray that in a real way, you would show that you speak into the chaos, that you're present and with us in the chaos, and that you are the one ruling over the chaos. And I pray for Faith Fellowship Baptist Church, God, that you would be the one who shows yourself to be big and strong and mighty and faithful and good and kind and patient to them, that you'd be leading them in this year that's ahead, that you'd be speaking to them and teaching them and growing them. Yeah, God, just that your will would be done here in this church, that they'd have a passion for proclaiming the gospel here in Brandon, that they'd have the joy of seeing new believers welcomed in to your family. God, thanks for the confidence that they can go forward with, knowing that you are the one in control. You will build your church. There is nothing that can stop that or overcome that. And God, we just give you all the glory because you're worth it. You're good and you're great, and we love you. We pray these things in Jesus' name. Amen.